My name's Clara, and for the past 6 years, I've been working at Lou's Diner, a little hole-in-the-wall spot off the highway. It's not much to look at: cracked vinyl booths, a jukebox that only plays half the songs, and a coffee pot that's older than I am. But it's my place. My home away from home. Most mornings, I'm here by 4 a.m., flipping on the lights and firing up the grill before the first customers stumble in. You learn a lot about people at that hour. Most folks are just tired, you know? Truckers with road-weary eyes, their hands wrapped around mugs of black coffee like it's the only thing keeping them awake. Nurses coming off night shifts, still in their scrubs, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. And then there are the old-timers, the regulars who've been coming here for decades. They sit in their usual spots, swapping stories about the good old days. Their laughter a little quieter now that so many of their friends are gone. But then there's him. Mr. Armani's suit. That's what I call him in my head anyway. He rolls in every Thursday like clockwork, briefcase in one hand and a scowl on his face. He's always perfectly put together. Crisp suit, shiny shoes, hair slicked back like he's about to walk into a boardroom. But his attitude? That's a whole different story. He never says, please, or thank you. Not once. He just snaps his fingers, points at the menu like I'm supposed to read his mind, and glares if his eggs aren't exactly over easy. Today was no different. He marched in, slammed his briefcase on the counter, and barked his order at me like I was his personal servant. I brought him his plate, careful to set it down gently, but he didn't even look at me. Just picked up his fork, took one bite, and then, clang, tossed the fork on the floor. Cold, he muttered, like I'd personally insulted his ancestors. I stood there for a second, my cheeks burning, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Mama always said kindness costs nothing, even when it's hard. So I bit my tongue, forced a tight smile, and picked up the fork. I'll remake it for you, I said, my voice steady even though my heart was pounding. Back in the kitchen, I took a deep breath, trying to calm the anger bubbling up inside me. Lou, the owner, was leaning against the counter watching me with those sharp eyes of his. Don't let him get to you, Clara, he said quietly. Some folks are just broken inside. I nodded, but my hands were shaking as I cracked the eggs onto the grill. I didn't understand how someone could be so cruel, so dismissive, over something as small as a plate of eggs. When the new order was ready, I carried it back to him, my steps slow and deliberate. He didn't say a word when I set the plate down. Just picked up his fork and started eating, his eyes fixed on the newspaper in front of him. I stood there for a moment, waiting for, I don't know, maybe a thank you or even a nod. But nothing came. I walked back to the counter, my hands still trembling, and poured myself a cup of coffee. Mama's words echoed in my head. Kindness costs nothing. But sometimes, it sure feels like it costs a piece of your soul. Last week, the diner was quieter than usual. The rain had been hammering against the windows all morning, a steady rhythm that made the place feel smaller, cozier. Most of the regulars had stayed home, and the only sound was the occasional hiss of the coffee machine and the soft hum of the jukebox in the corner. I was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door jangled. I looked up, and there he was, Mr. Suit. But he wasn't his usual polished self. His hair was plastered to his forehead, his suit jacket soaked through, and his tie hung crookedly around his neck. He looked messy. Human, almost. He didn't say a word as he slid into his usual seat, water dripping from his sleeves onto the counter. I grabbed a clean towel and handed it to him. Rough morning? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He didn't answer, just stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched tight. I poured him a cup of coffee, the steam rising in little curls, and set it down in front of him. Here you go, fresh pot. He took a sip, then slammed his fist on the counter so hard the mug rattled. Too bitter. Again, he snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. I blinked fast, the heat rising in my cheeks. My first instinct was to snap back, to tell him he could make his own damn coffee if he was so picky. But I swallowed the words and forced a smile. I'll make a fresh pot, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rain. As I turned to walk away, Lou stepped out from the kitchen. He's a big man, with a voice that booms even when he's whispering, and he doesn't take kindly to anyone giving his staff a hard time. Leave her alone, pal, he said, his tone firm but calm. She's been here since 4 a.m. She doesn't need your attitude on top of that. Mr. Suit froze. For a second his face did something weird, like a crack in concrete, like the mask he always wore was slipping. His eyes flicked to Lou, then to me, and for the first time, I thought I saw something other than anger in them. Shame, maybe, or regret. Then, without a word, he pulled a $20 bill from his wallet, tossed it on the counter, and walked out. He left his coat hanging on the back of the stool, the rain still pouring down outside. I stood there, staring at the empty seat, the $20, and the abandoned coat. Lou patted my shoulder. Some folks carry their pain like a weapon, he said. Don't take it personal, Clara. But I couldn't help it. I did. The next Thursday I kept glancing at the door, half expecting Mr. Suit to storm in like he always did. But he didn't show. Or the Thursday after that. 2 weeks went by and his usual seat stayed empty. It was strange, but I almost missed him. Not the snapping or the scowling, of course, but the routine of it. The predictability. It's funny how even the difficult people become part of your life when you see them often enough. Then, one Thursday morning, with the bell above the door jangled again, and there he was. But he wasn't the same man who'd stormed out in the rain. He shuffled in, his shoulders slumped, his suit rumpled like he'd slept in it. No briefcase, no snapping, no glare. He just sat down and stared at his hands, his face pale and drawn. I poured his coffee extra hot, the way he usually liked it, and slid it over to him gently. Rough day? I asked, my voice soft. He flinched, like my words had startled him out of some deep thought. For a moment, he just stared at the mug, his hands trembling slightly. Then, out of nowhere, tears. Big, silent ones rolled down his cheeks, and he didn't even try to wipe them away. My throat tightened, and I felt a lump rise in my chest. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. Instead, I grabbed a clean napkin and handed it to him, my movements slow and careful, like I was approaching a wounded animal. He took the napkin, but didn't use it. Just held it in his hands, staring at it like it was the most important thing in the world. The diner was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of dishes from the kitchen. I stayed behind the counter, giving him space, but not leaving him alone. Sometimes, silence is the kindest thing you can offer someone. It's like saying, I'm here, but I won't push. I'll just wait until you're ready. And for the first time, I realized that maybe Mr. Suit wasn't just a grumpy, bitter man. Maybe he was carrying something heavy, something he didn't know how to put down. I didn't know what it was yet, but I was starting to see the cracks in his armor. And for some reason, that made me want to be a little kinder. It took a while for Richard to talk. He sat there, staring at his coffee, the napkin still crumpled in his hand. The diner was quiet, the rain outside now a soft patter against the windows. I didn't rush him. I just stayed nearby, refilling his mug when it got low, wiping down the counter even though it didn't need it. Finally, he spoke. His voice was rough, like it hadn't been used in a long time. Her name was Maggie, he said, so softly I almost didn't hear him. I stopped what I was doing and looked at him. He wasn't looking at me, though. His eyes were fixed on the mug, like he was seeing something, or someone else. She used to meet me here, he continued, his voice cracking. Every Thursday, she'd order pancakes, even though she always said she shouldn't. Said they were her guilty pleasure. He almost smiled at that, but it didn't reach his eyes. I remembered her then. How could I not? Maggie was the kind of person who lit up a room. She'd come in with her bright red coat and her laugh that was a little too loud but so full of joy you couldn't help but smile. She'd sit right there, in Richard's usual spot, and talk to me like we were old friends. She always tipped me $10, even if her coffee ended up half spilled on the counter. You work too hard, she'd say, winking at me. You deserve it. She died last year, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper now. Cancer. It happened so fast. One day she was here, and the next. He trailed off, his hands tightening around the mug. I felt my chest tighten too. I didn't know what to say. What do you say to someone who's lost the person they loved most in the world? I kept coming here, he said, his voice breaking, because it smelled like her perfume, like she was still here. Tears welled up in his eyes again, and this time, he didn't try to hide them. He just let them fall, his shoulders shaking with the weight of everything he'd been carrying. I'm sorry, he said, his voice so raw it hurt to hear. I didn't know how to be anyone without her. I reached across the counter and squeezed his hand. It was cold, trembling, but he didn't pull away. "You don't have to apologize," I said softly. "Not to me." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time I saw the man beneath the suit. Not the grumpy, bitter customer who snapped at me over cold eggs, but someone who was broken, lost, and trying to figure out how to keep going. It's funny, isn't it? How hurt people either crumble or turn to stone. Richard had chosen stone. He'd built walls around himself, hiding his pain behind anger and sharp words. But now, those walls were cracking, and the man inside was finally starting to show. I didn't know what to do or say to make it better. I don't think there's anything you can do to fix that kind of hurt. But I stayed there, holding his hand, letting him know he wasn't alone. Sometimes that's all you can do. And sometimes it's enough. Today Richard came in. It had been a few weeks since that rainy morning when he'd finally let the cracks show. I wasn't sure if he'd come back after that. Some people, when they let you see their pain, they run from it. They disappear, like they're afraid of being seen. But not Richard. He walked in quietly, his suit neat but not as stiff as it used to be. He didn't snap his fingers or glare at the menu. He just sat down at his usual spot, the one by the window where Maggie used to sit, and waited. When I brought his coffee, he looked up at me. And for the first time since I'd known him, he smiled. It was small, hesitant, but real. "Clara," he said, his voice steady. "Could I get pancakes?" I grinned. "Extra syrup?" He nodded, and there was something in his eyes. Gratitude, maybe, or relief. Like he was finally letting himself have something good, something sweet, after so long without it. I went back to the kitchen and made the pancakes myself, even though Lou usually handles the grill. I made sure they were perfect, golden brown, fluffy, just the way Maggie used to like them. When I set the plate down in front of him, he stared at it for a moment, like he was remembering something. Then he picked up his fork and took a bite. "They're good," he said, his voice soft. "Just like hers." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and left him to it. When I came back to refill his coffee, he was gone. But he'd left something on the counter. A $100 bill, folded neatly under his empty plate. I picked it up, my throat tightening. It wasn't for the food. I knew that. It was for the napkin I'd handed him that rainy morning. For the quiet understanding when he'd broken down. For not making him feel small when he was already shattered. Lou came out of the kitchen and saw me standing there, staring at the money. "What's that for?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I shook my head, smiling through the tears that were suddenly blurring my vision. "It's not for the food," I said. "It's for everything else." Lou nodded, like he understood. He's been around long enough to know that some things can't be measured in dollars and cents. I tucked the $100 into my apron and went back to work. But I couldn't stop thinking about Richard. About how much courage it must have taken for him to come back here, to sit in the same spot where Maggie used to sit, and order the pancakes she loved. Mama was right. Kindness does cost nothing, but sometimes it gives you everything. It gives you moments like this. Moments where you see someone start to heal, start to find their way back to themselves. And it reminds you why you keep going, even on the hard days. Richard didn't say much that morning, but he didn't have to. His smile, his quiet thank you, the way he looked at those pancakes like they were a gift, it was enough. And sometimes, enough is everything. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this story. It means the world to me that you've joined Clara, Richard, and the folks at Lou's Diner for this emotional journey. Stories like this remind us of the power of kindness, the strength in vulnerability, and the beauty of human connection, even in the most unexpected places. If this story touched your heart, made you smile, or even brought a tear to your eye, I'd love to hear from you. Let me know what you thought in the comments below. Your thoughts and feedback mean so much. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing for more heartfelt tales like this one. Hit the like button if it resonated with you, and don't forget to share it with someone who might need a little reminder that kindness can change lives. Thank you for being here. Your support keeps these stories alive. Subscribe for more emotional, heartfelt stories, like if this touched your heart. Comment, and let me know what you think. Share to spread a little kindness. Until next time, take care of each other and yourselves.